Good morning from Prague, everyone, wherever you are, and welcome to the first event of the second day of the Migrating Archives of Reality conference. This conference is part of the international research project Victor E, Visual Culture of Trauma, Obliteration and Reconstruction in Post WWII Europe. My name is Lucie Česálková, and before I start with introducing our keynote speaker, Nanna Bonde Thylstrup, let me say a few words about the rationale of the conference and our motivations to invite Nanna. In Victor E, we are both researching the post-war non-fiction film and visual culture, thus doing a standard historical research of collecting data, both visual as well as written, about that period, and we are producing standard academic output like articles, presentation. And we also curate virtual exhibition that will also include a teaching toolkit. And for that, we collaborate with our archival partners to digitize parts of their collections that are relevant to our research and that we'd like to make public. We also record oral historical interviews with witnesses of the post-war reconstruction and relate their experiences, their lived memories to our archival material. So in other words, we digitize, we produce new digital content, we want to publish it, and we want to make people to learn from it. And this makes us entangled in a complex net of relations between digitization, ethics of use and reuse of archival material, its consequences for cultural memory, knowledge sharing, etc. So basically everything Nanna covers in her research. And we know we are making important decisions on an everyday basis, like selecting films for digitization, selecting clips for virtual exhibition, publishing the testimonies of eyewitnesses. And the awareness of the complexity of these current processes led us to critically re-examine every single decision we make. And this is why we are organizing this event in a way to create a platform for discussion on these topics and to learn from colleagues and such bright minds like Nanna. So now I'm going to introduce Nanna, give you a few words about her background. Nanna Bonde Thylstrup is an associate professor of communication and digital media at Copenhagen Business School. In her writing, she is interested in how media theory, cultural theory, and critical theory can unpack and unfold issues related to datafication and digitization. And she is the author of the book, The Politics of Mass Digitization, published by MIT Press in 2019. She has also written about infrastructures of forgetting and remembering, gendered epistemologies in digital infrastructures, archival effects, small media, content moderation and care, reuse ethics, environmental media, and data waste. And she also contributes to exhibition and artistic research practices too, which also makes her very relevant to this conference, where we want to connect both theoreticians and practitioners from archival institutions, for example, with artists. And currently, she organizes the research cluster Digital Transformations and Knowledge Production under the Digital Transformations platform. And besides the book on the politics of mass digitization, I'd like to mention also collaborative publications that arose from research and intellectual collectives of which Nanna was a part. And these are really recent books: Uncertain Archives, Critical Keywords for Big Data by MIT Press 2021, and Warchives, Archival Imaginaries, War and Contemporary Art from Berlin, Sternberg Press 2021. So welcome, Nanna. We are really honored we have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this generous introduction, and congratulations on a really wonderful conference. So I'm so pleased to be able to engage with your research project and the people who tune in for the conference today. I'm really excited about both the presentations that were yesterday, and I also look forward to the presentations today. So I'm honored to be able to kickstart the day. So as I was...
May I just have a super short organizational note I forgot to say at the very beginning. Sure. It's just a note for the audience that we are collecting questions for Nanna. You can do it during her talk immediately as you wish. And you can use 3 channels, actually. You can comment on YouTube, you can comment on Facebook, or you can write us an email to victor.e.prague@gmail.com. You can find all these informations in the event description on YouTube, and you will also see it during Nanna's talk. So feel free to ask questions, and I will collect them and ask Nanna after the talk. So sorry for the interruption.
Not at all. Yeah, I look forward to engaging with the questions as well. And as I was just saying to Lucie, so my presentation, I was so inspired by the program. So the invitation was to give a presentation based on my book, The Politics of Masterization. And inspired by that, that's always dangerous. But I actually wanted to draw some links between the book and the research project that I'm currently undertaking. So my presentation will be sort of a two-pronged presentation, and hopefully you'll be able to see the links. I'll try to make them as I go along. Let me see here if, okay, here we go. So, so much tech. So this is the title of my presentation, The Politics of Masterization, and a subtitle, because I'm connecting it to my new research, could be "And Machine Learning." But I wanted first to start with this image. So I do that often when I talk about my book, because it's one of my favorite images when it comes to the politics of masterization. So masterization in my book is considered or conceived as assemblages of peoples and tools, spaces, ideologies, and invisibilized infrastructures. And so what's going on in this image, so it was shared by Andrew Prescott from Glasgow on Twitter. And we're seeing a staff member of the British Library ironing a paper before microfilming it to ensure a clear image for subsequent digitization. So I really like this image for multiple things, right? So first of all, I like it's very analog. We see questions related to gender in there. We see multiple moments of remediation. And I also just like, I don't know if you've ever seen these tiny ironing boards that people use for ironing newspapers. So there's a lot of wonderful technology in this image as well. But what fascinates me about this image is also this woman with her tiny ironing board is far removed from the interfaces of mass digitized spaces that we tend to visit when we see Europeana or Google Books or Monoscope. So these spaces that I've written about in my book. But I believe it's scenes like this that can help us better understand the politics of mass digitization. And I think that that's important, not least because few of us understand, and you're part of the lucky ones, those of you who work in this research project, right? How sites of mass digitization have come to be. Yet many of us now rely on their infrastructures for our daily work. So in this reliance, we're quietly changing our habits of reading and writing and watching images and even remembering. And thus, we also change the politics of our engagement. So my book is trying to grapple with these changes, as well as offering a sort of cultural, historical, and political contextualization of these interfaces that are often completely devoid of historicization. So in a sense, trying to look at the infrastructures that subtend the interfaces we see when we think about mass digitization or use mass digitization. So these histories about and imaginaries of remediation far precedes the digital infrastructures we're familiar with today. Histories that include visions and dreams of universal and remediated archives. So here I include Paul Odlet and Henri Lafontaine's documentation science project called Mundaneum, which was sort of envisioned to gather together all the world's knowledge and classify it according to a universal system they developed called the Universal Decimal Classification. But I also love just the images of how knowledge through remediation becomes liberated from from the containers and silos there were encapsulated in, for instance, in the form of books. It also belongs to the emergence and expansion of microfilming that began at scale in the 1920s, but still continues to this day. And so lodging itself into these longer cultural histories of mass digitization and extending their perspectives to the digital age, my book seeks to understand mass digitization and its place in cultural history and culture, asking questions such as, how did mass digitization become a moral imperative? That means, why do we take it for granted that we need to digitize? And why do we need to digitize on a massive scale? What are the political logics governing these mass digitization projects? And what new questions do these projects give rise to? So the basic premise of my book is that mass digitization is a political phenomenon that ties together local, national, and global infrastructures in ways that both work in continuation of, but also profoundly alter the politics of cultural memory. So when I started writing my book, however, the predominant mode of speaking about mass digitization was much more in technical terms. So this was around, actually, oh my God, it's such a long time ago now. It was around like 2010, 11, right? That I first started thinking about this. And at that point, questions about mass digitization either revolved around the technological innovations that would enable us to bring cultural heritage online. So I have in my book, for instance, images from patents that enable faster page turning from Google Books. So as well as, of course, scanners themselves. So what technological innovations can we imagine that would enable mass digitization? Or it would be technical problems around the copyright problems of doing so, right? So how do we harmonize copyright legislation so that we can better enable the translation of cultural heritage to online form? As political practice, however, my sense was through my research that mass digitization also raises significant political questions, not only related to technological innovations or copyright, but more classic questions about, for instance, representation. So what works and institutions, for instance, should be selected. Here I took an excerpt of an image from the partner institutions that make the foundation of Google Books, right? So often when we enter Google Books, what we do is, if we use it for work, for instance, we enter a title, and then if we're lucky, it comes up. And if we're even more lucky, we have access to parts of the book and not only these snippet images. But my interest there was sort of, okay, so what bodies of works actually constitute Google Books, which appear to us as a universal access to all the knowledge in the world, but is actually, of course, only a portion and a specific portion. So Andrew Prescott, that I spoke about before, has also spoken about, this being an elite library project, for instance. How would Google Books look like if they had rather partnered up with small libraries in the countryside, for instance, or workers' libraries? So, of course, these choices also impact the collections we have access to. Another question is about representation, right? What's the right form of representation? And this question, I think, becomes especially pertinent when we talk about visual material and especially non-fiction films. So I was also interested in the infrastructures that should uphold these mass digitization projects, right? So here we have a nice constellation between two images. So traditional cultural heritage infrastructure as we know them from libraries, and sort of also an archival structure. And then, of course, a data center and very new one. I think that these questions, I don't know how much you followed the recent fire in the South African libraries at the universities, where, you know, an immediate response was, this is a tragedy, we should have digitized these books, but also scholars that urge caution to only see digitization as a form of preservation. And that's also a discussion in my book about digitization not necessarily being the best form of preservation, but it's a very good way of giving access to something. And obviously also thinking about destruction of archives that around the same time as a fire took place in the South African University Library, there was also a fire in a data center that caused the destruction, you know, in a different place in the world, but caused the destruction of people's backup files around the globe. So these questions about the infrastructures, what does it matter where the data center is as well? You know, how does that impact the user of these archives? And then I was interested in the rights, these changing rights, and especially our cultural understandings of rights of both the author and the user, right? So here I take an excerpt from, I wonder how many of you know Monoskov. I use it often, and I took my image of my book here because I actually fully endorse this shadow library. So it's a chapter in my book on shadow libraries, right? But I mean, it is a question. So what rights do authors have in terms of, you know, the remediation of books? And I think also, again, one of my other examples in the chapter on shadow libraries is called UbuWeb. And they host a lot of, you know, artistic films as well. And I think that these questions about shadow libraries, or I don't call it illegal, but illicit communication and transmission of knowledge also raises questions about the politics of value in cultural heritage, right? So in UbuWeb and in certain parts of Monoskop, what they say is that they're rarely contested on the grounds of them offering access because the value of the stuff that they hold is already not considered too valuable, for instance, for cultural heritage institutions. So if UbuWeb is hosting experimental films, art films from the 20s, it's not necessarily as big of a monetary problem for the cultural heritage institutions as, say, a blockbuster movie. So there are also those questions. So what I found so fascinating about Masterization when I started researching it was then that on the one hand, I could see a lot of these sort of historical trajectories and continuities, especially also like this classic cultural heritage sort of drive to collect and preserve and accumulate and organize knowledge, right? So what Jacques Derrida would call like this desire for the archive, so that we digitize more and more, and it can never be enough. And on the other hand, I was also fascinated by sort of this old school or traditional form of thinking cultural collections and the power that's related to something like scale meet these new logics that we often call like big data, for instance, right? So at the time that I was writing, there was really a talk of a big data gold rush in the field of cultural memory. And I think that still persists, especially in a lot of policy discourse on, you know, the reuse and the value of reuse of cultural heritage online, right? So this data or big data discourse is premised on, you know, that you can unlock more value from archives by making digitized material available for other purposes as well, right? And so at that time, people were talking about cultural nomics, and it was a completely new way of analyzing culture, for instance, that relied much more on quantitative methods. But it was also a way of, you know, again, so repeating this idea of liberating content from the confines of physical products so that they can be put to infinite reuse purposes, and thus potentially also producing sort of value that goes outside what we commonly understand as cultural value. But this big data discourse is often driven by sort of a non-situatedness, so that data comes from anywhere or at any time or with any method. So big data is very rarely talked about in historical or contextual discussions. So I thought that these two forms of discussing data or content were really interesting, and how they meet and what the politics of their negotiations are between some of these tech companies and cultural heritage institutions. And especially because, as anyone knows, even if things are big data, and they often appear to magically appear online, anyone who's been involved in mass digitization projects know that digitizing cultural content is a very corporeal and laborious affair. So it's not only something that just magically and disembodied happens in the cloud. So here we're seeing one of my favorite blogs that is collecting examples from Google Books, where you see, for instance, something like fingers or pages that have been scruffed up, or a mistake in the scanning. So I think it's called the art of Google Books. But these things, appear, and they're reminders, sort of these ghostly traces, a reminder of all the labor that goes into creating these collections for online consumption. So what kind of politics do we find in mass digitization then? Well, a lot of different forms of politics, right? So that cannot be reduced to one. But in my book, I talk about that we do see some patterns. For instance, that we see that a lot of mass digitization projects are late sovereign, in the sense that on the one hand, they feed on local communication and digital infrastructures, but on the other hand, they often also in some form or other relate to sovereign imaginary. So take Europeana, for instance, which is a European cultural memory, or DPLA, which is sort of the Digital Public Library of America, but still they also rely on and constellate globally. And then they're infra-political, and what I mean by that is simply an attention towards the politics that take place beneath the radar of what we usually detect as cultural politics, sort of for instance, in the form of symbol politics or representation, but that they also take place in decisions about, the standards to use, the infrastructures to use, so that we have to expand our cultural political spectrum of understanding what makes a cultural political decision beyond simply questions related to representation. So in that sense, then, mass digitization projects both adhere to and rely on cultural imaginaries and infrastructures of sovereignty, but they also undermine them through material, cultural, and economic networks. So what questions can my book help you unpack then? Well, if you're working in this field or with these questions, hopefully it can help you think about the complex politics and power structures of mass digitization, and help you unpack some of the cultural imaginaries that subtend mass digitization, as well as think through the material and social infrastructures of mass digitization. But given that this conference is centered on how digitization creates new modes of access and circulation for nonfiction films, especially within the context of trauma and reconstruction, for instance, and that yesterday's keynote spoke on questions related to reuse, I would like now to turn, so now we're at the second part, my attention to my current research topic. So my book focuses primarily on books. And here I would like to talk a little bit about sort of what happens with these digitization of non-fiction films, but also speak about what new infrastructures that they enter into contact with, and what that raises of questions for the ethics, for instance, of reuse. So which ethical and political questions does remediation of nonfiction films give rise to within machine learning settings? So as this conference website notes, and that's where I took a little description, the digitization of cultural heritage enables nonfiction film content to constantly migrate across venues as well as cultures. And one of these venues and cultures is the field of machine learning. So one place into which they migrate then are systems that are geared specifically for machine vision. So not geared necessarily for the human eye, but geared towards training and classifying moving images. And this migration, I argue, raises new questions, not only for the emergence of new cultural memories, but also for the ethics and politics of the reuse and the moments of transgressions. And here I include a quotation by Jamie Barron, moments of transgression that involves. So many, I don't know how many of you are acquainted with machine learning and training data. But so first, let me just explain why that's interesting. Well, first of all, it's interesting because the global push for machine learning has given rise to an increasing demand for data, but also engendered sort of a proliferation of data sets across both public and private repositories that hosts millions of data sets, often under an open license. So this is supported by, the political and policy initiatives around open access data, for instance. And these data are often drawn from diverse areas of social life. So data sets have not, even if they constitute a foundational element of machine learning, they rarely come into focus in their own right. But in recent years, a critical discourse on data sets has begun to emerge, which disturbs the idea of data sets as simply operational instruments of digital knowledge production. And these initiatives situate them instead as critical archives of social-cultural data. So I follow Joe and Timothy Bruce's call to think about data sets in archival terms as collections of social-cultural data by approaching data sets through the lens of critical archival study. So I suggest that critical archive studies offer a rich trove of resources for thinking about not only the politics of data sets, but also the ethics of data set encounters. And I think that those questions are interesting to raise in this context as well. So my inquiry here belongs to this new, relatively new, or within the last 2-3 years, discursive formation that I then in this presentation and in an upcoming article call critical dataset studies, which each in their way, with each their disciplinary approach, try to probe and understand and situate data sets, especially offering close readings of how data sets are collected, organized, distributed, and deployed. So artistic research on data sets has played an especially crucial role in drawing attention to the politics of image reuse in data sets, and also distributing this attention to broader audiences. So here I include different examples, and I'm happy to share titles with you afterwards. So cutting across these works is an interest in core cultural studies, political questions about access and accountability that also form some of the foundations for this conference. So combined, these new discursive formations have engendered a broader discussion on the ethics of data sets themselves, focus not so much on their contested role creating algorithmic bias. So this is what has dominated a lot of discussion on machine learning up until now, has been, the bias in how we deploy systems. But this is really going to the foundations of machine learning. So the conditions of the productions of data sets, we might say. And as a response to this recent critical attention to data sets, corporations and universities have partly and completely removed access to some of the most prominent data sets used for machine learning, barring their reuse. So these removals emphasize the contested nature of data sets, but also the risks they now carry in terms of personal and organizational liability and unresolved ethical questions for the institutions that host them or give access to them. Yet such gestures also show the complicated nature of dataset deletion as a form of reparative practice, because even if we remove access to a data set, and that at first glance seems like a finite gesture, closer attention shows how the iterative nature of machine learning, because of its archival infrastructures in the digital, challenge linear imaginaries of origins and ends that subtend traditional deletion practices. So it's not like we can just go back and shred the paper that contains the images or the film roll, because these now exist in multiple iterations. And a recent study shows how iterations of these removed data sets remain even after the removal of the original data set. And that led the authors of the report to conclude that the removal of one data set, for instance, only constituted a cosmetic response to ethical concerns. So this problem of derivatives is partly enabled by principles of interoperability, for instance, and modularity, outlined in the previous, outlined in these often policies on how to make cultural heritage available online, where a strong emphasis is always on interoperability. And interoperability, of course, allows us to engage with archives, but also enables a new form of spread of archival material outside the domain of institutional control. So as Wendy Chun points out, digital media are moreover marked by what she calls an enduring ephemerality. On the one hand, enabling endless circulation of content, but also relying on their ability to get rid of older, inaccurate information. So there's this tension in digital media to, work as an enduring ephemeral that is very different from a traditional archive, where we have, for instance, with a film roll, it has a certain lifespan. And in digital media, that lifespan becomes very different and actually relies on, ironically, constant moments of deletion to be able to constantly be upgraded as well for new forms of access. So we see this dynamic at play in these retractions of data sets, for instance, that even if they become removed, they still haunt digital networks and torrents, both in original forms and as derivatives. And these challenges have led scholars to point out the importance of ensuring that contested data sets are called out not only in the production, but also their subsequent uses in, for instance, articles or conference papers and further modeling. And I agree with this, but I also want to call for a more expansive intervention that can meaningfully acknowledge and care for these human traces that remain lodged within machine learning systems. And here I really want to draw back to some of what Jamie Barron talked about yesterday. Right? I argue that such registers might meaningfully draw on sort of critical archival and visual theoretical works that deal with the ethics and affects of iterations and remains and traces. So I draw here and I'm inspired by performance scholars such as Rebecca Schneider, for instance, and I can warmly recommend her work if you don't know it, who mobilizes an attention to archival iterations and repetitions to show the transtemporal nature of archives and how the past is never entirely dead. So Schneider draws on the concept of remains to articulate this immaterial connection between past, present, and future. And she notes in her work that if the past is never over or never completed, remains might be understood not only as object or document material, but also as immaterial labor of bodies engaged in and with that incomplete past. Bodies striking poses, making gestures, voicing calls, reading words, singing songs, or a standing witness. So following, sorry about that. I forgot to say. So following Schneider, the register of remains opens up to a response that weaves past and future in resonances with each other and creates what Rebecca Schneider calls a responsibility, sort of responsibility, both in the sense of calling the past to appear for account and being called by the past to respond with account. So while seemingly straightforward, such an engagement often turns out, and I'm guessing that this is what you encounter in your research project, it turns out to be incredibly complex, partly because these archives represent scenes of unbearable historical weight, and partly also because the methods by which we encounter these traces risk reproducing rather than subverting exposure of vulnerable archival subjects, right? So this becomes very clear in the presentation Jamie Barron gave yesterday, right? And very clear in certain archival contexts, but it becomes much more difficult to detect when we talk about data sets. And this is what I'll get into now. So this is one image of a machine learning training data set for machine vision that can detect moving images, right? So this is a massive data set hosted by YouTube, and this will help YouTube classify, categorize images, but obviously this is also open source, so anyone can access. So I chose non-triggering category called Tupperware, I think I chose, but you can choose different categories and then enter that. But as we all know, YouTube is not only Tupperware, YouTube is also host to an incredible amount of traumatic material. And these questions, therefore, I believe are very pertinent to how we engage with these data sets. So exploring this, let me see here if it works. Yeah. Exploring this claim and linking these issues to the themes of this conference, I now turn to the artwork Lacework by software artist Everest Pipkin, which is an artwork that uses artificial neural networks to re-envision the videos of another training data set called MIT's Moment in Time data set, which does just that. And so to this section, I want to acknowledge Daniela Agostino's work, and I'll get back to her as well, but this is part of a chapter that we're also writing together. So using algorithms that stretch time and add details to these images, Pipkin creates a series of hallucinatory slow motion vignettes from the videos of everyday actions that form the collection. So by manipulating these sources of the videos of the MIT dataset, Lacework presents what Pipkin refers to as a river of these moments flowing from one another into this cascade of gradual unfolding detail. In the essay that accompanies Lacework, Pipkin notes the difficulties associated with watching and engaging with the data set, partly because of its size and form, and partly because of the lack of consent from the people depicted in the videos. So what Pipkin does is actually sit down and watch every single video in that data set. And part of what's difficult when we talk about the form is because each video is shortened to a 3-second segment. So which also makes it cognitively difficult to engage with. And they describe partly how they remove the sound to make it easier to watch, because the sound would make each jump too boring. So as Pipkin notes, the researchers did not ask for permission to use these videos, and all ownership of and control over the image is pulled away from the person who held the camera and from what that camera depicts, even in moments of extreme vulnerability and pain. And here I hear resonance going back to the presentation yesterday. So in this sense, The control mechanisms of data sets belong no longer to those included in data sets, neither those filmed nor those filming, and as such they also invoke what theorist Anna Lauren Hoffman calls data violence of inclusion. And I just want to read this quote about Everest Pipkin's experience engaging with this data set. In the archive, there are moments of extreme emotion and personal vulnerability, tears, screaming, and pain. Moments of questionable consent, including pornography, racist and fascist imagery, animal cruelty and torture, and worse, I saw horrible images. I saw dead bodies. I saw human lives end. So grappling with these ambivalences, Pipkin's engagement with this data set reconfigures data sets from mere operational standing reserves to affective archives, which are percolated by human labor and emotions. And Pipkin notes here as well, even though I'm probably the first person to watch all of moments in time, every part of the data set has had human eyes on it before. This is because after being gathered and cut, the videos of moments in time were automatically uploaded to Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which is a crowdsourcing service that connects requesters to workers to generally perform small computer-like tasks for pennies. It is owned by Amazon and takes its name for the chess playing machine. And Everest Pipkin has been working at such a service themselves. So specifically, Pipkin shows the vexed intimacy that these data sets generate, in which people's data is circulated, sourced, and enmeshed with other data without consent, and then watched and labeled by workers who bear the brunt of such a difficult task. So acknowledging this vexed intimacy, Pipkin blurs the images, trying to create a veil over these subjects to carve out a space for viewing these images that acknowledges the problematic ways in which these images are scraped from the leaky containers on the internet. So Pipkin's work resonates with important discussions within the field of, for instance, critical archival theory on how to stage careful archival encounters with archives that contain trauma, atrocity, and abuse, and acknowledging the ambivalent role exposure and visibility plays within these encounters. Indeed, while methods of exposure can powerfully challenge invisible infrastructures and hegemonic ideologies, they also run the risk of re-exposing archival subjects to further abuse and reinforcing deeper normative and gendered ideals of what it means to lay something bare. So visual cultural scholar Daniel Agostino offers the notion of archival encounter to outline the ethics and responsibilities involved in digitally encountering materials that, as Agostino calls, that carry persistent power differentials and unresolved political demands that needs to be heard. And this is also what we heard in Jamie Barron's consistent and nice emphasis on power relations involved in gaze. Agostino and those whose work she engages in dialogue with allows us to understand that encountering dataset traces also involves the risk of subjecting those traces and those entangled within them to what Fuentes calls archival second-order violence. Moreover, and crucially, they also remind us of the potential of archival theories and practices to work as instruments for social and restorative justice in critical engagements with non-fiction film material in machine learning practices. So significantly, these works that often goes under the moniker of critical archival studies remind us not to think of traceability, for instance, to think of it as a form of cultural iterations that unfolds pasts and futures within the present that are in ways that are perhaps felt, but not always remain legible for us. And this, I think, is really the case with machine learning systems. As literary scholar Ray Chow points out, two distinct approaches to or frameworks of traces stand out within this critical tradition. A Marxist materialist concern with the unevenness left behind in socioeconomic situations, and a post-structuralist concern with theorizations of linguistic, subjective, and spiritual remains, sort of in the form of these notions that we know: trace, différence, gram, graph, mark, inscription, spectre, debt, translation, forgiveness, and so on. So both of these strands, I argue, remain relevant to the ethics of reuse of non-fiction film images in data sets and machine learning. So while we don't tend to think about data sets as archives of non-fiction film in the traditional way, archival, and here I also include, of course, the scholarship that you're producing that engages with these archives, these theories that emerge from that can help us unpack the ethico-political stakes of such data sets, as well as the new politics of masterization they give rise to. So I started out by exploring how masterization has changed the politics of cultural memory, focusing on books. But I've, in the second half of my talk, attempted to expand these thoughts into the new realm of masterization and machine learning, namely the reuse of nonfiction films in machine learning training data sets. So these data sets have become a new center of attention in ongoing debates on how to repair the harms done by complex computational systems. And in this way, they reiterate discussions that also include critical discussions on source code and algorithmic formulas. But they also call for critical engagements that reach beyond these fields of AI ethics or critical data studies, to include scholars such as those gathered here today, who know about and have given great consideration to the ethics of archival reuse and re-encounters, especially of trauma. So while it can be tempting then to treat data sets as root causes and gestures of removal as a form of justice or repair, my presentation has sought to explore an expansion of the ethical and conceptual register that mobilizes scholarships such as yourselves, as well as the theoretical notions of traces and reuse. So my humble suggestion here is a critical visual studies and critical archival theories offer one valuable resource for thinking through the ethics and aesthetics of such dataset encounters. And I now look forward to talking to you about these possible avenues. Thank you for listening.
Many thanks, Nanna. At this moment, I will only repeat the question, the notion for our audience that we are collecting their questions. They can comment on YouTube, they can comment on Facebook, and they can also write us email to victory.prague@gmail.com. Thank you, and we are looking forward to your questions, which I will be pleased to ask Nanna. And again, many thanks, Nanna, for your rich talk, actually very topical after the year of massive intensification of the use of digital repositories. I think that we all have encountered this for research, for teaching, but also for access to culture, actually, in general, in these new conditions of the pandemics. And I also very much liked how your talk totally related to our research, to our research project, and to what was already said yesterday, both the implications of mass digitization with appropriation, reuse, misuse, the topic of Jamie's talk, but also reminding us that this technical solution presented as oriented to future so much informs our relation to past. And as I have the chance to pose the first questions, being the chair, I will do so. And what for me, in my thinking, in the last years with conversations with archives and decision making about digitization and curation of the virtual exhibition, we saw that the politics of mass digitization is interestingly intertwined with different motivations of digitization. And you've mentioned the motivation to digitize for preservation. Mm-hmm. And another motivation might be to digitize for access, like directly. And these two motivations actually it has to deal with various cultural as well as legislative logics. And while this means that while we are speaking about digitization for preservation, often the questions of canon came into play, or then to the questions of repeating and iconization of images that belong to this canon. But when we speak about digitization for access, like in my view, we see a big problem with copyright. And I saw some studies that proved many cultural heritage institutions actually make accessible simply orphan works, because this is the simplest way for them to avoid like any copyright problems. And in some ways, these two cases, like the canon on the one side and the orphan works, are two other different sets of data, different sets of cultural values in some ways. And the question now for me is, can you see some ways or the best practices to achieve diversity, not these exceptional solutions for the digital archives?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was certainly one of the most fascinating topics, I think. Also, just for like part of my research was involved in sort of doing field studies or interviews with people working, for instance, under the EU Commission and in some of these different Directorate Generals who each have their own ressort as well. And, I can share with you a scene that I really liked, which also relates to this question about preservation and access, which an interview, and I think it's in my book, an interview with a wonderful diplomat who's working on preservation of film heritage. So that was her field of responsibility or area of responsibility. And basically, what she was explaining to me in really nice terms was, the impossibility of challenging the political forces in the EU that had to do with copyright. So she was saying, this is almost an impossible, and even the location of her office, which was sort of in the suburbs, so not in the fancy buildings, but in the suburbs, but clearly understanding also the materiality of the material she was working with, where she also really wanted to emphasize that digitization, at least for her, was never about preservation. She was looking at these film rolls and she was like, they're fine, at least for 120 years, they'll be there. And of course, digitization gives it an afterlife, but is not a mode of preservation because it implies constant migration of material. And this is, I mentioned Wendy Chun in my presentation, and this enduring ephemeral of the paradoxical nature of the digital, that in order to remain, it needs to be constantly deleted and reconstituted, right? So it's a very dynamic material. And I think that everyone who's been working with digital archives have heard like the horror stories of bit rot, etc., right? So that you digitize something, and I think this happened, for instance, for the British Library in the early years, that they digitized a massive material and suddenly it was inaccessible simply because of bit rot, but also because of new updates to software systems, etc., right? It's difficult for us even to shift from one computer to the other. So these are really questions that requires a massive apparatus, and of course, tech companies, for instance, have that when they work with servers, right? But it really is something that requires a massive technological apparatus. But in relation to your question then of, how we might find a better way, what I heard often was also this talk, and I guess that you've also encountered that, this, 20th century black holes, for instance, which what people call it, right? That we couldn't mass digitize material that was under copyright still, which meant that our cultural memory stops at around 1920, right? So I am not a legal scholar, and I describe in my book these various attempts and political forces that go into, for instance, this harmonization and the ideas and imaginaries that even go into harmonization of copyright within the EU as one. And I also try in my book to look at different ways that these different mass digitization projects have tried to negotiate the law, right? So, and what she explained to me as well, this woman working with the film heritage, was, Google they digitized first. I mean, it was incredibly controversial when they started digitizing, right? So, and they were working in the spirit of these Silicon Valley companies, right? They were just digitizing and then asking permission afterwards through this whole, legal debacle, right? And the EU projects abide by the law, but try to change the law then as they do, right? So for instance, through this push for harmonization of copyright, which is a really complicated process with a lot of heavy hitters involved. And then we have projects like Monoscope and Ubu Web and all these shadow libraries that sort of, operate in the shadows of the law. So, and again, I want to emphasize here because, sometimes these places become called like pirate libraries or pirate sites. And I think that scholars like Kavita Phillips, who bring a post-colonial analytical perspective on even these questions, and I think that also relates to yesterday's discussion on the ethics of access, on the ethics of the right to reproduce, are ultimately also anchored in, colonial imaginaries of what it means to do original or fair use. So what Kavita Phillips points to is at the beginning of, the Lawrence Lessig open source craze, where everyone was just open source, open access. Even at that time, and I think that Kavita Phillips actually calls out, and I think that's in my book as well, calls out Lawrence Lessig for making a distinction between, the good ways of remixing cultural heritage and then a Chinese piracy and sort of, which is then by implicit, unoriginal or cheap or something that's not favored, and so that becomes something that should still be deemed illegal, whereas the good ways of reusing or remixing, and which then you have to ask, where does that then take place, right, and what's included in that. So I think that the question you're asking is deceptively simple, right? And I have no answer to it. But what I'm fascinated with are all these different political, that you can't just boil this down to a question about, changing the law, for instance. I mean, you really have to take into consideration all these cultural complexities as well.
Yeah, I mean, you are right, and we are really encountering this on our everyday research basis, especially when we are for example, recording those interviews with eyewitnesses. This is a very, very sensitive work question, because we are working with people who lived their lives in the post-war period, and some of them really experienced a lot of traumas during the war, and their post-war experience is very much informed by the war experience. So, and then again, like the questions of GDPR, the questions of publishing all these data, but still, like, knowing that we are collecting something really valuable for the future, but we can't use it unethically. We need to discuss it with all those people. How do they want to be present, and explain them the ways we want to present them in some context online. So this is what we really do in our research, and I very much like your mentioning in the first part of your answer the notions of instability and uncertainty we are encountering with relations to these new types of archives and datasets, because this is also what was questioned yesterday with the relation to the Visual History of Holocaust project, which definitely is something related to these kinds of questions of instability.
Yeah, and I think that what you like, so the question that you ask, the one strand you ask about the legal apparatuses, right, the GDPR, etc. But then there's the ethical apparatuses as well, right? And there, I think that that's why I drew on critical archival studies for this presentation, and all those people who really work in wonderful ways with how to engage with these cultural heritages and these statements, memories of trauma in ethical ways. And there I don't know if that's something that you engage with, but people like Kim Kristen, who's been working on Mukurtu, and Temi Odomozu, who's been working with the Danish and with more or less, resonance in the Danish cultural heritage institutions related to colonial material held by the archives here. I think that there's a rich body of work with these people, and Daniel Agostino as well, of course, that I mentioned here, to really think through Michelle Caswell, people like that. And I think that it's especially also for what you talk about, one of the issues related to digitization is, that people can also have consented to one form of access. So for instance, April Hathcock and people like, oh, what's her name now? I forget, hopefully I remember, but has written on Tara Robertson, who's written on, the ethics of digitizing lesbian porn magazines, where those performing in these porn magazines, on the one hand, it's a wonderful resource to give access to see these, cultural histories that might not have taken up a lot of space, and remind of alternative histories, especially in relation to gender and porn. But on the other hand, these people may have said yes to access in analog form, but never in digital form. So that I think that, all those questions, and that becomes even more important to create that ethical pushback with that enormous push that goes for open access data. And that's what I tried to sort of indicate in my talk on machine learning, right? That this push for open access to data comes not only from people who want to watch these individual videos, for instance, but also who want to train systems so that, all kinds of material can be harvested for the purposes of machine learning. And I'm not de facto against machine learning. I'm just saying the ways in which it happens right now warrants concern.
Yeah, we have a question, actually, the first question, and I think we can then follow, because also the question of gender and racial politics also is very important, besides the decolonization. Maybe we will have time, but I would like to let the audience the chance to discuss. And we have a question from Francesco Pitasio. Thank you for the wonderful and thoughtful, provoking talk. I was wondering about one issue. You've mentioned two crucial questions for contemporary archives, interoperability and archival encounter. Mm-hmm. This latter somehow reversing power relations. However, in your view, what are the chances for interoperability, which predesigns the chances for collation and originates in access policies planned by current power relations for fostering archival encounters? What is the shift digitization prompts in this dialectics, if any?
Wow, that's a long question. So let me just make sure that I get it right. So the question, and thanks so much for the question. So the question, Lucie, if you can just help me, asks about the possibilities for making interoperability happen, or could you just read that pair again?
Yes, I think it is so. However, in your view, what are the chances of interoperability which predesigns the chances for collation that originates in access policies planned by power relations for fostering archival encounters? So I see there some relation between Francesco wants to address between archival encounters and
interoperability.
It's interoperability. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I'm so sorry, Francisco, if I'm not answering in the way that I can hear that your question is has a lot of complexity in it. So it's difficult for me to get the richness, and please follow up with me if you want. But basically, interoperability is an interesting discourse that I have also analyzed in my book on, what does it mean? Where does this push for interoperability comes from? What cultural logic underlies interoperability, right? And so one thing that we might say with interoperability is that it relies on, modularizing content so that it can interface with other forms of content, and you can exchange or make connections in new ways. And each time you create a sort of, and here I draw on Tara McPherson, that's why Tara Robertson, Tara McPherson, I always get mixed up, but Tara McPherson's wonderful work on Unix and looking at the racial logics that subtend the logic of modularization in computers. As she mentions, each time you modularize something, you also create a sense of forgetting of context. So that these moments or initiatives or moments of modularization that is the precondition for interoperability, or at least many forms of computational interoperability, then creates new questions for how we encounter material, right? So how much content can we allow? We can just think about when we try to create an Excel sheet, what kind of information do we get in there? And how can we, to what extent does meaning become lost if we exchange one form of, or one element of knowledge with the other? So I think for me, it's just a question of thinking through these logics that subtend the computational systems we interact with in every day, to think through, okay, is there something even in the computational form that then becomes, a policy discourse, because it starts at the level of the system, but then it becomes a policy discourse. And here I have, people like Waskasa from Harvard, and I forget the other person, but wrote a book called Interop, for instance, like a social theory of interoperability, where you then take these computational logics and make them into social theories on how we interact. And I think that it's just, for me, it's just relevant to be aware of and, pay attention to these moments in which a computational logic becomes translated as well into a cultural logic. And that always warrants critical thinking, I think, for then, okay, what is it then that we encounter? I hope that answered your question. I don't know.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. I can only add from our research experience again that at the very beginning of our research, because we are working transnationally, and we tried to make our corpus as transnational as possible. We made one database that we are indexing all objects we saw for our research, mainly films, but also our visual cultural objects. And just to prepare the data set with all the keywords and all the vocabularies we are using for tagging these objects was a big effort, a lot of decisions again, and we knew that these vocabularies are not endless. We need to stop somewhere, but we still were questioning whether we are not losing some level of the image, of the narrative, of the rhetorics of films, because films are rather complex works with the sound, narration, rhetorics. A lot of people can be there, like historical people in our case. So we needed to cover all this, but at the same time, not to oversee it, any possible Excel sheet data. So this was really a core of our project, because we started with this and we are using it for relating films to each other, because through this, actually, it enables us to see a lot of patterns, again, like narrative, rhetorical, visual patterns transnationally. But it relates always back to how we designed the whole database.
I hope that you're writing all these reflections down, so people have access to those as well as the archives.
Yeah, I think so, that if you have this kind of manual behind, you can easily, or better understand the decisions behind each of curatorial and archival decision. We have another question. It's a question by Renela Sere. She's one of our panelists at the roundtable in the afternoon. Can you comment further on the idea that mass digitization may not always be the best way to treat excess archival material.
Excess or access?
Excess.
Yeah. Oh, so excess in what form? Can you tell me the context of the focus on excess?
I think it's like how do excess, not excess. So I can only say what is written in the
like
question.
EXCESS?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's fascinating. So it's just because I'm interested in the politics of waste and discard. And so when you talk about excess, then that activates my curiosity. So why masterization does not work for excess archival material? I wish I could talk to you, the person who asked this question, to hear more about the background for your question. I was just discussing yesterday with Daniel Agostino, my interest in, how archives choose what they, for digitization, especially the film archive here, where, okay, here comes a little anecdote. And I have no idea if this is what you mean by excess. But my dad-in-law used to work, or it was his dad, so this is a human memory faltering, right? But he used to work in the film archive, or in the film cinemas, or with the people who created the censorship guidelines. So he would cut up the film rolls for, the material that they couldn't show in the Danish cinemas. And then they said that every Friday they would tape those together and then show it on Friday, just like in a row. And for me, I was so curious that I called the Danish Film Archive to ask if they had those, excess material lying around. And they said, well, yes, but they're not digitizing it because it's actually, not considered worthy of conservation or access because it's not part of the formal canon. But they just chose to save it. But right now they're in shoe boxes and lying around. And there was only one film roll that someone actually taped 4 hours of film together of all these different cutouts and created one consecutive film, which they just called the censorship film roll, which is an amazing object. But, so for me, I would actually like to see more digitization of those kinds of objects that are deemed, not part of the formal body of a cultural heritage, right? The sort of the remain, or like the trace, or like the outcast or the detritus of a cultural heritage. But if that's not what you're asking about, if it's more like the moments in which you say maybe mass digitization is not the right way to go, well, then I think that it's exactly these discussions that we're having, right? And that's what I think that machine learning is really accentuating. What kind of, and I think that what Everest Pipkin's work is actually, in their field, emphasizing is what gets lost when you interact with material at scale, right? And especially questions about empathy. I think, if there's such a massive archive, how can you engage empathetically with it? And so Everest Pipkin, remarks on, how do you do this? Well, it's really traumatic if you actually watch through that 1 million, even just 3-second segments, right? But I think in the field of cultural heritage there, art theorist Temi Odumosu, for instance, has written a wonderful article that came out just recently. I forget the name. I'm happy to share the reference in Cultural Anthropology, maybe, because Temi Odumosu pushed back a little on this, mass digitization effort of the Danish archive of the colonial archives, which were being mass digitized as a form of a present for the US Virgin Islands to give access to this material in digital form, but only in digital form. So not the actual repatriation, but sort of a virtual repatriation in a sense. And what Temi Odumosu describes is also then, how do you engage and how do you face this material in digital form? Well, often in the form of like thumbnails, and you just scroll through, and then if it's traumatic material, like how do you actually sensitize yourself towards this material as not just seeing these thumbnails on a roll? And in that particular article, she engages with one image of a boy who's crying that was used as a postcard, and really tries to create a methodology of engagement which operates at sort of, you know, the intimate level instead of this, you know, massive level. So I think that that's just the question always that emerges when we talk about like scalability is, you know, the how or to what extent it operates counter Michael care. I think here actually Daniel Agostino also wrote a really wonderful paper on care and big data vision.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, we saw that there was a machine in play in the in our question sheet, because the spell checker changed the word. It was access, like the access. But I think that yeah, we can see how machines are working in background. But Rinella actually is starting a new project on colonial film archives. So I think it definitely related to her research and to her question. And we have another question. Paulo Villa asks, thanks for the brilliant presentation. I was wondering if you have encountered in your research, besides the topic of invisible labor of mass digitization, also its ecological impact.
Yeah, so this is an emerging agenda that you know, I think I talked to the National Danish Archive last year about whether or not they had any policy recommendations on, you know, the level of, you know, how much energy can they exhume? And I think that this is something that we will see more and more of, this attention towards the environmental impacts of, you know, digital processing and storage. I have not seen it, you know, so I really wanted to, but, you know, we have the time we have, especially during a pandemic, but it's definitely a research agenda that I would like to both engage with and contribute to. And I think that, again, here, to me, it's sort of the same, you know, thing that I argued in my presentation, where this shouldn't only be a discussion that happens, you know, for the people working in the field of, say, AI ethics or something like that, but it really also should involve people from the cultural heritage sector who have a long history and tradition of thinking through storage. Because I think that here, you know, now we're talking about this, but I think it's, you know, incredibly interesting to see sort of these environmental questions stretched back a little bit as well, right? So, I mean, my students don't remember emails where it says, think before you print or something like that, right? But these moments, or like the question, like in Denmark, we're not allowed to eat the herrings that come from the Northern Sea because they're, you know, there was a lot of paper mill production in those areas, right? So I think that there are like wonderful histories that not only focus actually on like the current developments, but also look at them at the backdrop of what has been going on before, and so create a larger trajectory or expanded view of the environmental dimensions of cultural heritage. I think that that's incredibly interesting. But for certain, and I mean, I'm participating in a, you know, but again, I'm saying these are really disciplinary, sort of, because they're so new as well, you know, it becomes very disciplinary. So I'm participating in an AI ethics workshop in June on exactly this issue, but it doesn't involve anyone from, you know, cultural heritage institutions, for instance. So this is what I'm advocating, that they should be there as well. They should partake in these discussions.
Yeah, no, it is a big topic now, and the institutions like film archives are definitely like dealing with it, both in terms of like building their new storages and like in the material sense, but also in terms of like digital traffic they produce.
Yeah, and I think that it also, because, you know, the question that ultimately arrives, so on the one hand, I think there, you know, these discussions mimic what's going on, you know, at a broader scale, is how do we solve these crises? Do we solve them through new technological innovations? So that's, you know, the hope of the data center industry, is that they can become, you know, like sort of sustainable. But then, you know, they still produce, and I think here works on critical data centers. Mel Hogan or Julia Vilkova, people like that, you know, have been fundamental, in Jussi Parikka, have been fundamental in showing, okay, what's the trade-off in, you know, creating sustainable data centers. But I think also just, questions about like, okay, if we don't just want to constantly innovate new forms of technologies that can save us from this, should deletion also be part of, the strategy, right? Do we have to constantly hoard material, or is this where we really say, okay, we have to choose? And there, we go back perhaps to like an economy of scarcity, as we've done before, but just for different concerns. And there again, I think that people who've then actually been trained in, making selections or even thinking about selections become incredibly important.
Yeah, thank you. Another question by Andrea Bruchova-Hruzová. Dear Nanna, thank you for your highly interesting lecture. Here comes my question. What is your opinion about using digitized material for educative purposes for free, and therefore without being charged by free for copyright? At this moment, when we have turned our academic and research lives online, this seems to be even more important to make clear how and when the material is used for education. And for now, I don't see that there would be some general agreement on this issue. Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, you saw me including an image of my own book on monoscope, so you will probably have gathered that I'm not like, totally averse to the idea of fair use, as we would call it. And I think that even these vocabularies, right, even the idea of fair use is an adoption of a US-centric, copyright framework that doesn't actually work, at least in European context, right? Because here we have droit d'auteur and droit moral. So it's a very different thing, but we've adopted this sort of vocabulary and logic. I mean, if you're asking me personally, what can I say? I'm more concerned about the questions that we've been discussing before about ethics, these ethics of encounters, that I'm worried about someone in an educational context, not contributing to that. At the same time, I think that I'm part of the Danish committee on the Udvalget for Beskyttelse af Videnskabelig Arbejde. So the committees and the organizations that seek to protect and ensure that rights holders have a proper framework, but I'm not seeing the major threat to rights coming from below. So I think again we come back to power relations, right? So I think if we have one educator in the context of an epidemic wondering whether or not it's ethical to use material for the purposes of online teaching, I think here, for me, these questions become much more interesting if we then think about, okay, who's mediating, for instance, these lectures? What happens with that lecture as it becomes lodged in, these new platforms as well, where, we're seeing people's lectures online and images used online, drawn for a very different purpose. So I think that, I guess I'd say, be mindful of the infrastructures that we're participating in, but just at the offset, not being a librarian, I can easily see a good ethical justification for using material in online educational settings.
Yeah, thank you. This actually relates again to what we are doing in the research, because as I said, we also work on a toolkit that should serve secondary teachers to use the post-World War II materials and to learn for their learning and in lessons like being it for history as well as for history of visual culture and so on. And we are facing all these questions mainly with another topic and it's related to ethics again. You've mentioned it in the last part of your lecture, the archival encounters with the trauma, atrocity, and these kind of violent images. We have a lot of stuff on mass graves, for example, and the Liberation is very violent event. It's the end of the war, but it's really violent event. And we still think that in some ways we need to it is important to let students know that these images were produced, and we can use them as a tool how to, again, like as a tool of media literacy in some way, in how to engage with these kinds of images, but we still are questioning ourselves how to do it, it correctly.
I would definitely. So I thought that the question was more related to a rights question, but for this, I would definitely, like, you know, again, revisit, like, for instance, this article that I mentioned by Temi Odomosu actually seeks to create sort of a pedagogical, didactical method of engagement that really thinks through sort of the relations in which things become, and then just be mindful of, you know, again, these sort of circulations that such images become part of. And I think that there's an article called Archives of Hate, where two archivists, I forget the names now, but you can Google it. It's a really nice article where they describe their work on digitizing Ku Klux Klan archives. And then thinking through also the, you know, the ways in which many of these images are also being mobilized, you know, by the right, or by fascist movements, you know, for political purposes. So even understanding that even if the intention of showing it is to deter or to create better ethical, you know, spaces of resonance, we can't be sure that the spaces of reception, you know, are attuned to those messages. And I think that that's also what Jamie was talking about yesterday in her talk, right? So that, you know, that at least if you communicate or share this material, like, first of all, you know, always do it within dialogue with the communities in which, you know, this material sort of belongs to. And on the other hand, also making sure, and I think that this is where Temi's work is just incredibly fascinating, especially the didactical methods that she develops, is to share it in a way that doesn't allow it to be easily co-opted into sort of these affective economies of hate, you know, where they can easily be redone into like stupid memes or, you know, fascist revisioning of history, or because we're just seeing that, right? That this traumatic material, you know, it doesn't necessarily only naturally create an ethical sense of responsibility, as Rebecca Schneider would call it, right? But there's also, and I think that they're actually also perhaps revisiting her work on performing remains, you know, on, so in that book, if you don't know it, you know, she looks at reenactments, sort of war reenactments, and examining what kind of gestures that prompt and ethical questions those reenactments imply. I think that, yeah, so it's a really difficult question, but there are people out there creating mindful ways of engaging.
Yeah, I mean, for us, the question of taking into account the communities, as you've mentioned, was the crucial one, because we really feel that it's a very important way how to think about our corpuses and about our data we have, and how we can deal with them so that it makes sense to the community.
Exactly. Yeah, I think there's a really nice project in Sweden on vulnerability and Holocaust archives as well, where it's also part of their methodology to really engage with and thinking through how to allow spaces, or like how to allow for vulnerability and how to mobilize vulnerability, not as a weakness, but a strength in the interaction with this material, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, that sounds really great. Yeah. I have a comment from Rinella, which was the author of the question with that problem we had, and she says, "Thanks, I liked the anecdote, and yes, please share the reference." And now I'm not sure what she's heading for. Like, what was the reference there?
Which reference? Yeah. So it can probably be anything from Temi Odomosu to Rebecca Schneider to Yeah, good question. I can share the links and then the Archives of Hate article. Some of these I can create that little spreadsheet of references.
Yeah.
Share afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you.
Usually I do it in the chat, but I can't.
Yeah, because we are streaming. Yeah. Sure. So sorry for this, and I think we definitely.
I'm amazed that you're making all this technology work. I'm really in awe.
I think we can definitely connect via email and with all participants that are interested. The conference email, whoever is interested in some references, please use it, and we will answer this. And as we do not have another questions, and I feel the time is coming, I would like to thank you very much. It was really a fruitful discussion. We touched a lot of topics relevant for our research, but I would also say very topical for today. So thank you very much, and I would like to invite the audience for another event of the conference. Now we have a lunch break, hopefully, and we start at 2 Central European time with the panel, which you need to connect via Zoom. So if you have a registration now, you use the Zoom links, and the panel is full of people with really artistic experiences. Documentary film as archive, film projects, appropriation, network practice. Luis Olano and John Wyver both are filmmakers who will share how they work with historical archival footage and how these kinds of works work in their pieces. So thank you very much for being with us. Thank you, Nanna, for your lecture and for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was a real pleasure for me to get to connect these dots in my scholarship. So it was a really wonderful, and I can't wait to follow the rest of the conference and your work in the project. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, many thanks and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.